All right, it is pattern plywood time once again. This video is sponsored by Arbortech, which means I'm gonna be power carving pattern plywood, which is something that I've been wanting to do for a while now, so let's just get into it. So my plan for this week's project is a pattern plywood stool with a carved top and 3 solid wood legs. And so I looked around my shop and I found just enough plywood, and it was pretty close to not enough plywood, to be honest. I was actually measuring the kerf cut on this piece because I was a little worried that the saw blade was going to take out too much material. I just barely got away with it. I cut as many strips out of that sheet of plywood as I could. I cut them down to 3 inches by 12 inches, and I got quite a few out of it. If you've watched a pattern plywood video on my channel before, you'll be very familiar with this technique. It's a whole bunch of glue ups, and then you cut them apart, and then you glue them right back up again. I broke up the glue ups into 2 separate sections just to make the process a little bit easier. And you'll notice on this one I used a little bit more glue. So the next step is to cut the 45-degree cut to make the chevron pattern. So you'll notice that I cut the first one in 2 passes, which was the smart move. And then the second one, I ended up cutting in just 1 pass. And as you can tell by the smoke that's starting to form on the right, that was not the best idea. It's just way too much wood for a saw blade to go through all at once, and you really don't want burnout inside of these glue ups, because as you carve away, you'll start to see those charred marks inside of the actual carving. So it's really important to take 2 passes, and as you can see, the second pass, it manages to eliminate the burnout almost completely. Now I'm prepping the second glue up to form the chevron pattern. And if you're gonna do this, just note that this side really absorbs glue like crazy. So you wanna be pretty liberal with your glue application. The block was all glued up into the chevron pattern, I decided to add a little bit more of visual interest to the piece by cutting it in half and then cutting off one of the sort of wild edges, the edge with all the pointy bits on it, and then flipping the pattern around so that I could get a little diamond pattern in the center of the block. In order to get a nice smooth curve on the seat of the stool, I used a really thin strip of walnut and traced that out to form a really nice arc. I then took it over to the bandsaw and trimmed off the excess. I only trimmed a little bit away from the line and then was able to clean that up on the belt sander. Now this Pac-Man ghost is ready to carve. I was hoping for a nice sunny day in Seattle, but in December that's not very likely. So I settled for what I could get. I opened up the door and I moved as close to the outside as I could be. I started off by tracing out the design that I wanted for the stool. I really wanted a nice flat edge on the top and then round it out, sort of like a tractor seat. I'm using the Arbortech turbo plane on this project, and I didn't really know how it would behave with all this plywood. The plywood grain direction is going all over the place, and I didn't know if it could handle it, but it worked like a champ. I was super surprised at the surface finish of it. It was shockingly smooth and didn't really tear into the grain at all, so really impressed. I started off planning on keeping the pointy front edge, but it became pretty apparent that I didn't really like it. It was calling too much attention to itself, and it didn't really help the design, so I just decided to lop them off. Now that I had the top of the seat rough carved, I can start focusing on the bottom of the seat. And this is the angle that sets the angle for the legs. I ended up with 22.5 degrees, and that seemed right to me. The table saw move that you're seeing me do right here is not recommended. I'm not sure it's the safest technique, and it definitely didn't yield the best results. You can see how much burning I got on it, and really what you should do is set the angle and slide it all the way through the cut, and then set another angle. I ended up figuring it out in the end, worked really well. Now I know better for next time. So now we're moving into the jig heavy portion of the build. I made 3 different jigs for this build, and this one's super simple. It's just a hinged set of panels, and you can set it so that you can raise and lower the base on your drill press. I cut a chunk of 2x4 that I could slide in and out, and it's cut at that 22.5 degree angle. So as you slide it in and out, you can raise and lower it and get it right at 90 degrees. I also found that I needed a couple shims in the front just to make sure everything was nice and square. And then I was all ready to drill. I'm using a Forstner bit on this, and drills a nice clean hole. I set a Sharpie mark at the top to make sure that I didn't bottom out and actually go through that freshly carved seat. Now we can move on to the legs. I'm not going to go into too much detail on this because I've put out an entire video on this process, but I'm basically turning these legs on the table saw. I don't have a lathe in my shop, and I've built a jig that really effectively turns legs, tapered, spindled legs on the table saw. You can set the angle, you can set the length, and make a whole bunch of different types of legs. If you want to learn how to build this jig, I've left a link to the video, and I've also got SketchUp files on my website for just a couple of bucks. You can see it works kind of like a giant pencil sharpener. Once you get the corners lopped off, you can just drive it through the saw and batch out a ton of legs. I mean, I made these 3 along with filming them in less than 30 minutes, and I'm sure you can get it up to a pretty decent clip if you've got to make a bunch of them. The setup's really easy, and the finish is surprisingly good. That was the thing that shocked me the most. There's a few little scratches on it, but for the most part, just a light sanding on the jig, and you can get these looking really, really good. And now we're on to jig number 3. So I'm taping up the legs here, and I'm taping them in the spots where the jig inserts, and it's just to tighten them up so they're nice and firm. And I screw it down and then even slide the drill press table into place, and that keeps it from wobbling too much. I bottomed out the drill bit, drilled down as much as I could, and repeated the process until all 3 legs were drilled out. And now it's time to go back to carving. I want to round the bottom of the seat, and I just use the legs and set them into position to figure out where to avoid with the carving. Now I can take the turbo plane and shave down those sides and make them nice and round. If you're new to my channel, welcome, and maybe consider subscribing and hitting that like button. That like button helps me out a lot. If you've watched a number of my videos, you might want to consider joining my Patreon. I have a Patreon page and a bunch of great patrons on there that help buy materials and pay for camera gear and editing software and stuff like that. Thanks. With the seat all rough carved, now I can start the sanding and refining. For the convex section, the underside of the seat, the palm sander works great, but for the concave section, you need something that has a little bit of flexibility, and that's where I started using the contour sander. The contour sander is also an Arbortech tool, and it's a random orbital sander that you can swap out the grits on, so you can get a really nice finish with it. With the seat all nice and refined, I can now shift gears to the glue up. It's time to glue the legs on, And this is a technique that I learned a little while ago. For gluing up dowels, I like to make little channels along them so that the glue has a chance to squeeze out, and it prevents the dowel from actually forming a vacuum. If the dowel goes in without those grooves, it can actually get stuck before it bottoms out. So definitely recommend doing that. It's just a little bit of extra work and it makes for a much easier glue up. Now, I will admit that gluing these legs on had me a little nervous. I was worried about them swelling. I was worried that they wouldn't be nice and square, even though I spent all that time building that jig. You know, every time you do a glue up, it's kind of a bit of a mystery. And I tried to move as quickly as possible, give it a couple taps, and all 3 legs, fortunately, they all bottomed out really nicely. One of them was a little bit off from square, and it's the one that I'm working on right now. And I'll address that issue later. There was just a little gap at the back. I couldn't get out, but I was able to fix it. I was able to do a little bit of a repair patch, and you'll see that in a little bit. So there's still a little bit of carving left to do on this piece, and I'm just gonna refine that edge that leads into the leg from the bottom of the stool. I'm using a tool called a Fortum. It's a flex shaft carver, and it's just essentially a fancier version of a Dremel. The motor is mounted far away from you, so you don't have to worry about it heating up, and it's also a little bit more powerful than a Dremel. But if you got a Dremel, it'll totally work for this process. So now I'm gonna repair that little gap that I have in the back of one of the legs. And fortunately, I made an extra leg. So I was able to cut off this little sliver from the top of that and then sand it down to fit. Once I got the fit really nice, I glued it up, set it in place, and it doesn't fit perfect, but it fit pretty well. And the main thing with this is it just prevents the leg from loosening up over time. If you were just to fill this with wood filler, it'd probably break apart and then that leg might loosen up in the joint. I'll finish up those transitions with the contour sander and make sure that they flow really nicely into one another. Contour sander is great for this just because that front edge can really get into that corner. And now I can flatten the feet. I set it up onto my table saw and then use a shim and a pencil to draw a line around the bottom of each foot. And then using that line as a reference, I can cut those pieces off and cut them nice and flat using a Japanese pull saw. You don't have to worry too much about these being perfectly flat, because what I like to do is put a piece of sandpaper under each foot and then run the foot back and forth on the sandpaper until it's completely flush. So with that, all that's left to do is pop my brand on the bottom of it and throw on a couple coats of finish. That's really nice. So this thing turned out great. I am so happy with it. Thanks so much to Arbortech for sponsoring this video. If you want to check out their tools, I have a link in the description down below. Also, I'm really curious what you guys thought of the narration of this video. It's only the second video that I've done with a narration, and I asked people on Instagram whether they wanted it on this video or not, and I got a resounding yes. So I'm curious what you guys think. Let me know in the comments down below, and I'll catch you on the next one. Thanks a lot. Bye.